seeing and listening to other people do it and you think they're better than you.
Sure.
You know?
It's the the imposter syndrome for all artists, right?
Right.
Even the great ones think I'm a fraud. You know, when back in '80, when Zeppelin was about to break up because of John Bonham's death, he was considered one of the greatest drummers of all time, and he would have conversations, with Robert to say, "I suck. I am a lousy drummer. I cannot do this." After how many albums and world tours and millions of dollars in cars, right? And I think that's just the curse of the artist: is you're going to be self-deprecating. And you're going to say, what am I doing? And it's usually like an issue of, I have better taste than what I think I'm producing, right? And that's kind of good.
And not only that, but as I improve, my tastes change so that I start listening to better people.
Right. And your taste is always one step ahead, but that's great because it drives you to improve, but it could also drive you to drink. It's like...
It's going to drive you mad if you let it.
Yes.
And the thing that frustrates me, at the point where you burn out, you got to realize you're doing something wrong.
Yeah.
And this is not just a musician thing. This is like an audio engineer thing. This is a producer thing. This is a VFX person thing. I know I've gotten close to burnout many times, or I've burnt out for a day. Mm-hmm. Right. And never that long. Have you experienced that where it's like a lot of burnout?
Yeah. Burnout's huge in visual effects. It's huge.
I'm sure.
And, and it's usually attributed to really long hours and impossible deadlines and stuff. But, that's an unsustainable model. Is if you're not enjoying it, like most things in art, if it becomes nothing but just pure drudgery and work, your work's going to suffer. You shouldn't be an artist. If you stop loving music because you're just listening to a metronome, you kind of forget why you got into it.
Have you needed to take a long period of time off after a project before?
Well, it's always good to take a break. Taking breaks is good. You got to get away, because if you get away, you change perspectives, you take a walk, you do whatever you got to do, you take a couple weeks off, and then you're reminded of why you love something, and you go back because you want to do more of it, right? You want to see what else you can achieve. Like whiplash, a lot of people I've heard from say, that's not really how you practice, by doing something until you bleed and someone is abusing you, over your head. I don't know. I've never practiced in an actual music school, obviously, but that just seems really detrimental to people's mental health, and, when I'm thinking of, I love big band. I love Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman. I love all that stuff. I can't imagine them practicing like that. Or maybe they did. Who knows? I don't know for sure, but that just seems...
Not all of them.
Brutal. Just brutal.
Buddy Rich practiced that way.
Yeah, I could see Buddy
Rich practiced that way. James Brown tried to make his band practice that way. And that's why there are stories of James Brown's entire band quitting at the same time.
Sure.
And walking out.
Sure.
Because they weren't taking it. No, that movie, there's a lot wrong with it. Yeah. There are a lot of things that do not make sense in relation to actual music and musicianship.
And getting better at your craft. And I was teaching, I still teach. I've been teaching for a long time. That's not teaching. Being abusive to someone that is ignorant of what you're trying to tell them. Ignorance, as a teacher, ignorance is welcome. I welcome ignorance because ignorance is just an opportunity.
Well, ignorant, you're supposed to come in ignorant. That's why we're here.
Yeah, that's why you're there.
If you're not ignorant, then why are you hiring me?
Right,
to
and we're
teach
all
you this?
ignorant. I'm very ignorant of many, many, many things, and that's why I continue to learn. But if I don't know how, maybe I want to go look up how a NASA rocket works. I'm not going to smash something over my head thinking, why am I such an idiot? I don't know how a NASA rocket works or whatever. But
yeah. And I think the same can be said for a lot of different people. Yeah,
sure.
It's fascinating because you have people who will do that to themselves, and you have people like Whiplash. And this is something that Whiplash showed is like you have this kid who starts out, right, who's a very casual musician who wants to become serious. And this is the thing about naivete and ignorance is that in a situation like that, you're not as skilled as you'd like to be, but you're not ignorant to what you are trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why that abuse is understandable and why that abuse resonates with a lot of us. Because even I had a piano teacher. He was not that bad. He wouldn't throw a cymbal at my head.
Right. Criminal behavior.
Try and kill me.
Right.
But there was at one point a lot of manipulative tactics that were, based on the fact that he knew I knew what I was doing, but he was trying to pull more out of me anyway and was trying to pull it out of me in a bad way. J.K. Simmons, right?
Yep.
His character isn't the only one that's abusing Miles Teller's character.
Yeah.
Miles Teller's character is abusing Miles Teller's character.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. And that is something that a lot of people have to kind of think about is for every abusive teacher, there is the student that's abusing themselves tenfold. Yeah. And that's kind of what happened in that film. And that's kind of what happened to my drummer. Not necessarily that he had an abusive teacher, but it was his drive that turned him to abuse his instrument almost like a drug. He needed to practice that hard. Just now we had touched on burnout in the VFX industry because, long hours, impossible deadlines, unethical, on verge of unethical deadlines. I've heard, I don't have any personal experience in it. I barely have any friends in the VFX industry, but I've heard some of these crazy stories.
Sure.
Like, we need this render of a dragon. We have no storyboarding. It's only green screen footage, and you have until Tuesday, and it's Monday night.
Yeah, and it's not just VFX. It's the video game industry I was in for a long time. It's very exploitative. When you're on fixed deadlines with fixed budgets, there's only one thing that can move, and that is the amount of hours you're going to give. That's a long conversation. We could talk about, artistic business practices. And people oftentimes they think, I want to be an artist, so I gotta take this abuse. I gotta pay these dues. And a lot of the producers or heads of these studios in many of these artistic disciplines, think, well, you're going to do this because there's 50 people standing behind you that want your job. There's a lot of that. And, I think artists, after a while, that especially they become quote unquote senior artists, they burn out and they go into something completely different because it just left such a bad taste in their mouth and that kind of a thing. But it's all about who you work for and who you're working with. And that, again, the burnout for VFX is usually coming from studios wanting lots of changes. Oftentimes a lot of artists, I think, get burned out because they're their own worst enemy. I was reminded of an artist who, it was a coworker who had their father was an amazing artist. And Walt Disney Feature Animation wanted to hire them. So they flew out to California. And before the interview, this gentleman decided to take a quick tour and walk around Disneyland. Never saw Disneyland. Was so intimidated by Disneyland and what they had accomplished, immediately got on a plane and flew home and never went to that interview and never became a Walt Disney Feature Animation artist. So, you can be your own worst enemy. And with artists, we're a sensitive lot, right? We're oftentimes temperamental. You have to kind of treat us a different way depending on the artist. And it's tricky being an artist because it's like that, It's combined with the fact that there's no right or wrong. As an accountant, you could say that zeroes out, the books are balanced. As a musician or an artist are saying, does that look good? Does that sound good? Does that taste good? Does that, it's so subjective.
Right. You can balance a checkbook. It's hilarious. The whole point of mixing is to balance a song.
Yeah.
But you will never be satisfied.
No. Because who's to say it's done? Well,
based on the fact that, Star Wars, George Lucas had those films, all the vis effects redone 40 years after those films were released.
Yeah.
And there are mixes of the Beatles records from 55 years ago still being remixed, remastered, and re-released that nobody's ever done.
No. And we have a saying, project is never done. It is simply abandoned. because you have to move on to something else. At some point you're like, you could mix this song for another 30 days. Will it sound better? That's debatable. Will you think it's done? Probably not, because it's subjective.
So let me ask you this. Let's say you had a project, time, you didn't have a deadline, money, no object. You could do whatever you wanted.
Mhm.
You could test it out however you'd like. If you took something out of After Effects and put it into insert other VFX software name here, would it be different?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And that explorative kind of mentality is huge. And even if it doesn't turn out and it turns into a disaster, you learn something from it. And I'm kind of reminded that, oftentimes in visual effects and movie making, there's a formula that's kind of very adopted, and people say, this is how you got to do it. And it reminds me of a movie. I was not on this movie. This was before my time, but it was a 1989, 88, 89-ish movie, Bram Stoker's Dracula by Francis Ford Coppola. And he wanted to have amazing visual effects and special effects and things done. And everyone he talked to wanted it to basically do it the formulaic way they wanted to do it. They said, we're going to green screen this, we're going to blue screen that, we're going to do that and the other, blah, 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 blah. And he kept saying, no, I don't want to do it like that. And he finally just fired everyone and hired his son, Roman Coppola, to just do it all practically in camera. And it's, so that kind of trap is very common where, in visual effects, very often you're presented with a challenge. We say, we have to somehow get this vision on screen. How can we do it? And there's maybe 10, 20 different ways to do it, all of various budgetary constraints or different approaches or different software, how many people's involved, and like anything, there's 20 different ways to do something. So, anytime I hear someone come to me and say, well, I only use this piece of software, or I only do things this way, that's a red flag, right? Because you're not open to seeing if I can get something done, like I said, with a couple of coconuts and some chewing gum, if it looks amazing, that's how we're doing it, So it's dangerous to fall into that trap of saying, this is how it's done, especially in art. I can imagine in your field, you have software, but you don't want to be a slave to the software. The software's still got to work for you, and a lot of times people say,
right,
well, this is what I use. And if the software can't do it, then it can't be done. And that's insane, right? So you always want to be on the verge of trying to break your methods, break your software, break your processes. And it may turn into a flaming wreck, but it may give you an idea to do something else a little bit different, which is huge. Now you're growing, right?
Right. My software choices are because, and I will inquire if you would emulate this, but for me, the way I do things or try and do things is in a way where the software is no longer a hindrance. The software falls away. It's just the work.
Yeah. It has
and
to
as soon as that stops happening, that's when I get pissed off.
Yeah. When the tools get in the way, then you got to get new tools.
Well, when I remember that the tools are there, that I'm using the tools, I want my software without plugging myself, without putting a microchip with a port into the back of my neck. I would like to be as ingrained and intertwined with my software as my use case will allow me to.
Yeah.
Which is why realistically, I kind of stopped doing music work or personal music work. When people come in to record projects, but if people ask me to do a project, or I know I'm going to be mixing a project or do something, that's why I don't use Pro Tools, because Pro Tools gets in my way.
Yeah.
Other softwares are similar, and I flow through Pro Tools. I can do edits. I want the tool to fall away.
Yeah. You need it to work as fast as your brain is working.
Right.
And so speed is paramount. Absolutely.
Now, let me ask you this question, because I know things like Blackmagic Design make
DaVinci Resolve.
They make DaVinci Resolve, but they make hardware tools to go in hand with DaVinci.
Sure.
And all that stuff. Are you one of those people that is strictly keyboard and mouse, or do you have additional hardware, and how does that integrate within your system?
Yeah, there are things out there, little track balls and things like that. I never really got into that stuff because you just with muscle memory. I'm just keyboard and mouse the whole way. And you mentioned After Effects a couple of times. After Effects has basically a huge problem that you've been describing is that sometimes some of the software is built where they're not really listening to the user base. And I don't even think sometimes they're using the same software that they're building because it's slow. It gets in your way. I don't want to have to look for things. When at first it's like, I've always likened it to playing guitar where first you want to learn guitar and you can't really play any song because you're just trying to get from that G to that C chord, right? And it doesn't sound like anything. And there's no rhythm to it. And then after a while, you stop fighting the guitar and you can get to those chords pretty quick. And then once you're there, you're actually listening to the music that guitar is actually producing. And now that's an extra degree of enjoyment, right? And that's kind of like how we do these tools is like, it needs to be an extension of yourself that it moves so fluidly and so quickly that if I'm doing too many steps, I'm going to lose my creative train of thought and I'm going to get angry at the tool, right? So that's paramount. It only comes with time. A lot of new students, they probably want to race through guitar because they just want to play that awesome song they love and they don't finger properly up perhaps something and they skip over it. And what you're doing is you're reinforcing garbage, right? Because you're not slowing down, unfortunately, to get it done. That's kind of like how software is. When you become an expert, like you're at the level you're at now, it's got to fall away. It's got to be just something that's helping you and almost predicting what you're going to do next. Or otherwise, it's in the way, right? And it can't happen.
There's this famous Bruce Lee quote that I think applies to people in our field incredibly well. Yeah. First, you have formlessness, and then you learn form. And then you have to relearn formlessness.
I like that.
In martial arts, and I practiced martial arts for about 12, 13 years and only recently stopped and might get back into it at some point. The whole point is if you get into a bar fight, right?
Yeah.
And you're a trained martial artist or you're trained in boxing or something, you're not going to square up.
No.
You're not going to spar like you do in a karate dojo.
Yeah.
You're not going to do that. You're going to fight tooth and nail.
Yeah.
And use every tool you possibly can.
Sure.
But the thing about the tools is you're going to forget the tools exist and you're going to use them as an extension of yourself. Mm-hmm. And it's the same thing here. You know, it does not matter that I know what Command Option F7 will do.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't. It matters that it happens. I know what will happen, but I don't need to know what will happen because it's already there. It's a thoughtless endeavor, right? Yeah. And that's why I love that quote so much because it encompasses everything from musicianship to...
and that's the true state of an artist, right? Because like when I'm starting to teach animation, there's principles of animation and I could read them off like it's some kind of recipe, right? But it's like driving a car. When you're driving a car, you're not actually going through the rules of the road in your head. You're just driving. And you have to get to that level of comfortableness to truly see what you're capable of. It's like, as a musician, if you're hindered by trying to figure out how to do that B7 sustained 4, whatever it is, if you're looking for that chord, you're not in the music, are you? You're kind of detached and you're a little bit worse for it because now you're struggling instead of really in the zone,